Hello and welcome to episode 40 of the Alfa Romeo Driver Podcast, brought to you by the Alfa Romeo Owners Club. I'm Guy Swarbrick, and with me this week, appropriately enough, as this episode was released in the middle of Autumn Alfa Day at the Yorkshire Wildfire Park, I have the chairman of the Yorkshire section, John Scott. Good afternoon, John.
Hello, Guy.
As usual in these things, we'll talk about various different things during the course of the next 20 minutes or so. But as tradition dictates, how did you get involved with Alfas in the first place?
I blame my dad. He was an Italian car nut. He was actually a dentist by profession, but he was what we would, in modern parlance, call a petrol head as well. And really, he loved his Italian cars. Actually, he was a bit of a Lancia fanatic rather than Alfas, but he also had a number of Alfas. So really, he was a big influence.
And when did that kind of parental influence turn into something that you couldn't kick and turn into a car?
Well, it's a long time ago, I'm afraid. It's back in the 70s, really. My dad, as I say, was a dentist, but he fiddled himself a little part-time job as the motoring correspondent for the dental magazine. And as it was all a big con, I think, because he wasn't the greatest journalist in the world. But what it meant was that he could actually get a car on test for a week every month from various manufacturers. And obviously, he had to be fairly sensible about picking the rough with the smooth, obviously, and balancing his input. But Alfa GB were particularly good, as were Lancia and Fiat, for that matter, at lending cars. So I was incredibly privileged during the 70s to be able to ride and actually drive an awful lot of production cars, but also, of course, Alfas as well. And that's where I really got switched on to them.
So did he do the same trick I do with my son of you driving it so he could take some photos of it moving?
That's it, yes. There was a bit of that. And also I drove it so he could have a few beers in the pub as well.
Brilliant. So when did you transition from driving the cars he had to owning your first one?
My first Alfa was a 1974 Sud TI. I bought that in 78, I think. And unfortunately, as with most Suds, it was an absolute joy to drive and to look at and so on, but it fell to pieces after about a year. It was very, very rusty and was unreclaimable, unfortunately.
So you were fortunate enough to be at the back end of the 3 to 5 year window when they when they started to fall apart.
Yes, it was. I think it might have been a goner even when I bought it, but I was sufficiently naive in those sort of days not to worry about it.
And they were they were worth it for the fun, despite all the foibles, weren't they?
Oh, fabulous! It was the most incredible car ever. I mean, the way it handled, the way it went, and I mean, I'm sure we're going to talk about. I had a whole bevy of Suds over the years, and that first one was still the best. Like a lot of these things that particularly Alfa produced, the best one of the range is often the very first one they brought out without all the bells and whistles and spoilers and bits of plastic wheel arch and that sort of thing on it. It was an absolute joy to drive. It was a revelation compared with the Mark II Cortina I had before.
So we don't necessarily need to go through all of them, but just take us on a kind of walk through the chronology of your ownership.
Well, okay. Next, when I got rid of that one, I got another Sud, which was a 1286 Ti. I think that was a kind of bridging car between the Series 1 and the Series 2, although I'm sure there are plenty of Sud people out there who will put me right on that. But then we emigrated to South Africa, and first thing I did when I got there was to buy an Alfa Romeo, which was a Giulia Super 4-door saloon.
Very nice.
For the princely sum of 400 Rand, which is about 50 quid now. And it was just an absolute joy. I mean, I'd never driven a 105 before, although I'd seen these things a lot on, in the flesh and on the TV and so on. And it was just fantastic. It was my wife's daily driver for 3 years, and it was. I'm told it was quite a rare one that you could only get in South Africa because it was a 1300 engine with twin side draft carburetors on it. So it went reasonably well, and we had a lot of adventures in that, including getting stopped at gunpoint for being accused of gun running. But I think that was an occupational hazard back in those days. Thank goodness it doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah, and I think that those Giulia saloons were always a bit of a rare sight, and I've kind of always in the back of my mind blamed the Italian job for the way they portrayed the police ones and their utter hopelessness, which was really unfair.
Every time that one comes out the sewer and goes into the river, I cry.
Yeah, and then the way they would run out of steam on the on the roof of the building. You think, no, that's not really what happened.
But that really got me into 105s, and I always said to myself, if ever the things fell into place, the one thing I would like would be a Bertoni Coupe 105, and that actually happened many years later. So when that Giulia unfortunately also fell to pieces, in fact, you wouldn't believe it, but I gave it away. What I wouldn't do for having that car now, of course, but I'm sure we all said that. We had a 5-door Sud TI, a 1500s twin carburetor one, and it was an absolute dog. It was awful. The trim in it was very poor. It was like sort of 70s Draylon, and bits fell off it, and everything went wrong with it. It was a horrible car. It really was awful. And during this time, my dad had a couple of Suds as well, a 4-door Super, which was used on the day we got married. And, well, to cut a long story short, he had to have it resprayed afterwards. It got decorated during the reception, which was unfortunate, but he was quite reasonable about it. He then went on to a Giulietta 116, which is quite a rare car these days. You don't see many about at all.
No.
And my one memory of that specifically was the gear lever. It had a very large plastic knob on the top, which was a sort of purple colour with sort of white grain, as it were. And when he wrote up his article, because he'd had one on test, he said he couldn't work out what colour he could describe this gear lever. And somebody turned around and said, acute inflammation. And I thought, yeah, that actually sums it up quite well, really. It was horrid. But then Alfas did that in those days. They still do that to a certain extent. He then went on to a 75 after that, a 2-litre 75, and that was a very, very nice car. That was a super thing. So there was a bit of a gap then, whilst the kids were growing up, etc., until we went on to a 156 Sport Wagon. This is the first car, the only car I've ever bought brand new. And in fact, I didn't buy it, as it happens. The clutch had broken on my Fiat Uno. So I said to my wife, I've got to take younger son off to his hockey game or whatever. Can you pop down to the Fiat dealer and get a new clutch for it? Gave her all the part numbers and everything else. And she rings me during this hockey game and she says, I think I've just bought a car. So I said, well, either you have or you haven't. She says, well, all right, I have then. And she found this 156, and it was old stock. The dealership was actually going bust at the time, so they needed to get shot of it relatively quickly. So she made them a ridiculous offer, and they actually bit her hand off, which I couldn't believe. So we got this 156, and on the order form, it actually said, subject to husband's agreement. And it didn't take me long to agree to it, I have to say. But that was a fabulous car. It was absolutely wonderful. It was a 2-litre twin spark, and we went all over Europe in that car. It was comfort. It went like the wind. It was great. It was really good, really good. We chopped that in a couple of 3 years later for a 156 Saloon, which was a 2-litre JTS. And mechanically, I always thought the JTS was the best specification of that era of Alfa. The slightly more horsepower, a bit more torque in the engine, and the closer ratios on the gearbox just set it off. And we had that car for 3 or 4 years as my wife's daily driver. And then our local Alfa dealer gave us a horror story about having to change the cam belt and needed this doing and that doing and the other doing. And as you do, of course, you leave the car in the workshop and you go into the showroom, don't you? And so suffice to say, it didn't come out of the workshop. She fell in love with a 916 GTV, which left me completely cold. I wasn't that interested in them at all. But she said, no, that's the one I want. I'm having that. And it's a very, very nice car. It's quite a rare one because it's a sort of anthracite grey, but it has a factory white leather interior. Ooh. Which I've only ever seen one other with that particular spec. So, and we've still got that car, actually. It's sitting in next door's barn at the moment. But, yeah.
Well, with white leather, it's probably a good job you can't get anybody in the back.
yes, yeah. My youngest son got in the back once, but he said he'd never do it again. It's, total waste of time, those seats. But, it's that's a very nice car. It's the 2-litre twin spark engine. Feels a little bit unpowered sometimes, but it's a great car for touring, So just chuck a soft bag in the back and go and queue up for the Channel Tunnel and take yourself off around France. It's a wonderful car for that.
And obviously things have moved on a little bit, but that was kind of widely acknowledged at the time to be one of the best handling front-wheel drive cars ever made.
Yes, it's I would support that. I think it's very, very good. As I say, it feels a little bit underpowered sometimes, but a couple of times I've driven the soft top version, and it doesn't have that same rigidity at all. It doesn't have the sort of strong feel, if you like. But this coupe, you can throw it into corners, and it responds very, very nicely. So in the middle of all of that lot, I forgot to tell you about my mother's car. She bought a 105 Spider, 1978 car. It had 50 miles on the clock. It was an ex-demonstrator, and she kept it until she stopped driving, which was 2-3 years ago.
Excellent.
And we sold it then. So she'd had it basically from new for nearly 40 odd years or so. That was one of my, as a small boy, that was one of my sort of go-to cars. You know, that was the pipe dream. And actually, when you got in it and drove it, it wasn't the most comfortable thing in the world with those pedals on the floor, and it was difficult to get in and out of. And it was a 2-litre, and it didn't go as well as I thought it should do. But I think maybe she didn't sort of open it up and blow the cobwebs out every so often, which you have to do with those engines.
Yeah.
We then moved on to my pride and joy, which is a 1964 Giulia Sprint GT. So I got my Bertone eventually. That is just, it's for me, it's one of the greatest cars ever invented. And I think that what really sort of excites me about it is it's such a balanced package. It's a 1600 engine, 110 horsepower maybe, but everything fits together. The chassis, the brakes, the gearbox, the engine. It's a complete package, and it is just such an absolute joy to drive. It's light, it's balanced, it corners completely flat, and it picks its skirts up when you ask it to. So that's my pride and joy, which sits in the garage, undercover, dehumidified, the whole full works, you know.
And was that restored when you bought it, or is that?
Yes, it had quite a lot of metalwork done on it. Luckily, none of the really major stuff, such as floors and valances and that sort of thing, they're all still original. But the dog-eared bits like wheel arches and so on had been tarted up. And it actually came with 2 lever arch files full of photographs and bills and all that sort of stuff. So it's got a long provenance. Actually, I got a photograph of the lady who bought it new the day she bought it. And she's holding a small baby in her arms. And it transpired that she actually got rid of this car and bought another coupe, which was a 1750. And then she got rid of that one and bought another 2-litre. Now, that car actually belongs to that baby who was in her arms at the time. He's a member of the club. And actually, we've met up a couple of times just to put the 2 cars together and take a photograph of them. What we haven't found is the 1750 that was missing in the middle. We don't know where that went. But Peter quite often goes to Alfa dues, and we meet up. We come across each other quite often because he's still got her last 2-litre. Right. So going on from there, the Alfa bug just kept biting and biting. I had, as a company car a few years back, I had a GT. It was a 1.9-litre diesel, and that also was a very, very nice car to drive. And one of the key things about that car was the seats. I had the Alcantara trim rather than the leather. And once you got in it, you were just located. And I'm sure it was the seats were a good shape, but that material was really, really nice. And I've now got a 2008 GT, which I use as a daily driver in the summer. And that's got the leather interior. And it's still very comfortable and very nice, but it's not as good as those Alcantara seats were. So that GT was a car that I picked up because I saw it in the magazine, funnily enough, because it was a JTS. I'd always hankered after that package we'd had in the 156 with that JTS engine and gearbox. And for me, that GT is the best incarnation of that particular model. I mean, I know there's a lot of V6 owners out there who would take major issue with me on that, but it's balanced and it goes around corners a bit better than a V6, I think.
And a lot more affordable because V6 prices now are through the roof.
Yes, they do seem to be going up. But that's probably one of my great regrets about Alfa ownership. I've never ever had a V6 Busso engine car, and that's kind of on the bucket list in some respects. But which one to buy is.
You mentioned your 156 Sportwagon. I went to buy a 156 Sportwagon, a 2.4 diesel. And happened to arrive at the dealership on the day they were doing the launch test drives for the 147 GTA, and walked out having ordered one of those. So that That was my only busso, which was completely impractical. It was absolutely useless for what I needed it for.
Right.
Because I had two young kids who were competitive cyclists at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So it lasted 18 months before I chopped it in for the 156 sport wagon I should have bought in the first place.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. Yes. You should definitely scratch that itch at some point.
I think the 147 V6 is a little bit of a hooligan's car. I'm told. I mean, I did road test one once, and I really liked it. I thought it was great. And yes. So I don't know, maybe a 916, but I got a feeling I might fancy a 166, to be honest. Just the getting older, maybe.
Well, that's another one that's on my wish list, is a facelift 166 with the 3.2 busso in.
Mm-hmm. So then I had a 2-litre 147, which again was actually somebody who was scrapping it, and I said, that's too good to go to the scrappy, give it to me and I'll tart it up, which I did do. It was intended to be a retirement car because I was coming up for retirement at the time, and it never really quite made it because the GT came along and actually a Lancia Delta came along at the same time, which didn't help. So the 147 was really sort of stood around and did nothing for a few years and had to disappear. But again, same 2-litre package, that you got in the 916 and the 156 and so on. I just love that package. I think it's great. And then there's a Sud Sprint. I couldn't get away from wretched Alfa Suds, so I bought this one, which it wasn't an oil painting, I've got to say. Had quite a lot of welding done on it, but it was a driver, and the idea was to strip it and restore it. But I just completely ran out of time, so I decided it's better to make the space in the garage. That one went probably about 6 months ago, actually. I know there's a chap over in the Northwest who's got it now, and he's doing wonders with it. He sent me some photographs, and it really looks nice. But again, that was one of those cases of buying the nicest one of the range, which was an early one. It was a chrome bumper, 89 car, and the only problem was somebody had put 33 mechanicals in it, so it wasn't that original. So that's really the sort of brief potted history of Alfas. I love them. I can't get enough of them.
So that's the ownership history. When during that timescale did you get involved with the club, and how did that come about?
Well, to be honest, quite late on. We lived in Cheshire for a long time, only moved across to Yorkshire about 10 years ago. And I joined the club in Cheshire, but unfortunately work commitments and that sort of thing, I never really took a great deal of part in it. I think I only went to a couple of section meetings and that was about it. So, but when I came across to Yorkshire, we sort of said, okay, well, we're going to make something of this now, particularly having bought the Bertone Sprint GT. I wanted to be part of the club, and so I joined the Yorkshire section and basically went along to all of their pub meetings, which were great. There's some very, very interesting people there. And we got to know quite a few people who are pretty good friends now. And really, I felt that with a lot of these cars, because I've actually got a couple of Lancias which my dad left me when he passed away. For me, the people that go with the car are very important, and I do tend to find that particular makes or particular cars have particular types of people around them. And some of the Lancia crowd weren't really my cup of tea, I suppose. And they also didn't live anywhere near here either. So there's hardly any Lancias in Yorkshire. Well, Lancias that I would have gone on with anyway. But I really found the Yorkshire section was very friendly. It was very active. It was very dynamic and nice people. So it just went on from there, really.
And when did you go from being a member of the section to being actively involved in running it?
Relatively recently, only about 6 months ago. We've had a few changes in the Yorkshire section over the last couple of years, and it's a little bit smaller than it was. The membership's still pretty good. I think it's 170, maybe 190 members, but Yorkshire's a big place, unfortunately. So having a pub meeting, we do it as centrally as possible, but people don't really want to travel an hour and a half, 2 hours to a pub meeting. So that's something that we need to tackle going forward. So I just felt that I wanted to try and do my bit to sort of bolster the membership and the interest, and bring my sort of habits and foibles to the meeting. I mean, my great passion in life is historic sports car racing. So I'm very keen at setting up people who want to come to Cadwell Park, to Donington, to Alton Park. They're all within striking distance of us here, to go and watch Alfas racing, old Alfas. So we've done that a few times, and of course we do live in God's own county, so we've got some fantastic roads to go and do run-outs. So we do quite a lot of that as well.
In terms of the role, I think we've had a couple of section secretaries on the podcast since we started. I think Jonathan Griffin's the chairman of the Thames Valley section, but we didn't really talk about his role that much. How do you divide the role between yourself and Nicholas Williamson, who's the secretary?
I'm ashamed to admit that Nicholas leads it. Nicholas is a very dynamic and very experienced secretary. I mean, I knew him very briefly through Lancia connections before when I first joined the Alfa section here. And he's a very experienced secretary. He's very good at getting things organised and getting people going. So Nicholas really leads things. He's very good at putting ideas into substance. So yeah, I really need to. I support him rather than the other way around.
And this podcast will go out on about halfway through Autumn Alfa Day, which is obviously will have been an excellent event by the time people listen to this podcast.
Absolutely.
And I know that John Griffiths and Nick Wright were somewhat involved in putting that together. But what's the section's involvement in that been?
Our response to it really is to say, well, okay, what can we do to assist? We're very keen to do our own Yorkshire Alfa Day, hopefully next season. And we did have some ideas about getting something this year, but obviously circumstances have prevented that. So when the venue came up at Doncaster for Autumn Alfa Day, we sort of said, well, what can we do to help? And John and Nick were quite keen that we were there and in a sort of local support role. So come Sunday, there'll be quite a few of us sorting out car parking and all that sort of stuff.
Or will have been, depending when you listen to the podcast.
Absolutely.
Obviously, for listeners, this was recorded a couple of days before the event. Although we have now done, I think we did some of the Mitcar podcasts we did at the event. Yeah. So you can't always tell. So you talked about plans for the future. Anything that you can share with listeners now? You talked about Yorkshire Alfa Day. Anything else that you've got in mind?
I think that Yorkshire Alfa Day is going to be the big one next year. I'd like to think anyway. We're planning a lot of drive outs and kind of treasure hunt type events as well, because the pub meetings are important and to me they're the cornerstone of the section. But the actual appreciating your car and appreciating the other people who appreciate them is done when you're actually on an event or doing something. So I'm very keen to organise some runs up in North Yorkshire and North Lincolnshire maybe. And the other thing that we do quite a lot is to combine with the Lincolnshire section. We liaise quite closely with them on their events and invite them to our events and so on. And that's a very good formula. That's one thing I would really encourage any section to do, is to get together with any section which is close to you or just across the border or whatever, and compare notes and see what you can do, maybe joining up together.
Again, we talk about this occasionally on some of the podcasts. You talked about what you'd like to do within the section. Is there anything you would like to see the club do more of, or do differently, or do to support the sections that you don't think they're doing enough of at the moment?
I think it depends which section you're in. I think it's a fairly open secret. We're trying to rebuild the Yorkshire section and give it a slightly different outlook, a different image than we had before, and we've got very small numbers. So really, we're very much focused on getting people to come to events, making things agreeable to people that they want to actually be involved. So in that respect, we're possibly a little bit inward looking. As far as the club is concerned, I think it does a very, very good job. National Alfa Day was absolutely fantastic, although my car broke down on the way down there, which was a pity. But we did the drive of shame and came in a Jeep instead. So I'm not talking about that. No, I think the national events are very, very good. I think the magazine is also very, very high quality, very well presented. By a number of people I know in other car clubs, they pick up my Alfa Romeo driver and say, "Wow, this is fantastic, isn't it?" It is very well presented. I'm slightly biased in some respects because I'm very technical. I'm an engineer by profession, and I take these things to pieces all the time. So I would like to see a lot more technical forums and technical advice. But generally, I think the club does a very good job. The biggest problem is the sheer size of the club. Sort of distilling it down into bite-sized pieces, which will actually do something meaningful. And I think the way you're doing it through the sections is probably the best at the moment.
Yeah, and I think that's always the dilemma, isn't it? When I look at producing the magazine, one of the criticisms we do get is that there was nothing about my car or my section in the latest issue.
We've all been,
and with 111 years of history,
yeah,
you can't cover every car or every model in every issue, but we do try and keep as much variety as we can.
I think the register, the people who run the register, the individual registers, have a big role to play there. I mean, I joined the GT register probably a couple of years ago, and I'm absolutely amazed at how dynamic Kirsty is. She's amazing. She's posting Facebook things. She's inviting people to things. She's getting events together, and she's very, very dynamic. And I think it's a lesson to some of the other people who run the registers. You've got to register for a reason. It's not just listing all the cars that still exist. I'd like to see some of them a little bit more proactive. There was a chap who ran the 916 register up until a couple of years ago, maybe. And he was very hot on the technical aspects of the 916s, which was great because, I'm always worried about what's going to break on those next. In that respect, I do think the people who run the registers could have got a really key role.
And I think there is, a bit like the geographic spread of the sections. Some of the registers have, tens of thousands of cars still on the road, and others have, a dozen or so.
Yeah.
So I think there is a different dynamic just depending on the size of the register. Yeah. But I think the good news about Kirsty, and I'm not a GT owner, but I am a member of the Facebook group amongst other things. I think the good news about Kirsty is she's joining the main board, so hopefully we'll get some of that energy and enthusiasm added to what we do at a national level as well.
Oh, I'm pleased to hear that. I saw her nomination in the magazine, so that's a great thing. Yeah. I think as a group of owners, we've got to keep plugging away and making sure that A, we keep our cars on the road, and B, we keep the community sort of vibrant. And I think the club is very good in that respect. And we just need to, as I say, we're concentrating on developing our own section because that's really where our energies need to be channeled at the moment. And if we can do that, then it's good news all around.
So that's been brilliant. Thank you very much for joining us.
That's my pleasure.
Well, that's all we've got time for, but we'll be back in 2 weeks' time on Sunday the 26th of September, when I'll be talking classic car restoration with Ian Jeffcott. Episode 41 will be available to download from 1:30 p.m. from the club website, from YouTube, iTunes, and everywhere else good podcasts are found. Until then, stay safe.